Okay, well, let's finish off an activation I would have done at the end of the last session if I'd had time, not wanting to take up your lunch. So Hebrews 4:16, let us draw near with confidence to the throne of grace, so we may receive mercy and find grace to help in time of need. Now that is an actual place. It's actually a place you can go and experience and engage. It isn't just praying and looking to get some help. So that means that we all have the resources of heaven available to us, just like Jesus. He was able to access everything in the realms of heaven, the courts of heaven. Yeah. Why do you think he knew that Satan desired to sift the disciples? Because he had access to the court in which Satan came and said, I have legal right to sift this bunch because they've got a lot of fear and they're all going to run. So Jesus said, no, you can't. No, he said, I'm going to pray and intercede for you, basically, that your faith won't fail. Because he couldn't override a legal access that the enemy had. But he did support them all in the process. So Jesus had access to everything in heaven, so do we. So we can engage the river of life. The river of life is the most wonderful place to be because it's flowing from the throne of God. It's the essence of the life of God. And in that essence, we can experience it. So we can go in the river can flow in us, we can drink that river, we can breathe in the river, because it's not H2O, it's the life of God that's designed for us. There are all sorts of things in the river, great place to be. Waterfalls, we engaged that previously. Father's Garden, another beautiful place to go. Tree of life, it's fantastic to eat the fruit on the tree of life. Well, they're there in season all the time for us to eat, not just to have a nice passage in Revelation that you read and think, oh, that's nice. It's personally there for us to engage. The throne of grace, it's there for us to engage. As we step into Eden, we can ask Jesus, the Father, to engage in some of those wonderful things. Ask him to take you on a trip, to show you some of the things in Eden. If you're used to doing it, go to wherever you feel you want to go. But if you're not, then ask the Father to give you a guided tour. I can give you a guided tour, but I can only take you to the places that I'm going to go. He can take you all to different places that you need to go. So I'm going to go on this tour myself, but I want you to be led by Jesus, by the Father, to anywhere he wants to take you. Now, here are some of the places you could go, but he might well take you anywhere outside of that as well. So we have this door within our spirit. So within our door, this first love gate, we have this door within our spirit, and he wants us to experience that door. So what I'm going to do this time is make this full screen, as I've reminded myself that I need to make it full screen, which I keep forgetting to do. So I will make it full screen for those who are watching online, so they won't be focused on me. So basically, Jesus is knocking at the door within your spirit. And you have the choice whether you open that door or not. But when you do open the door, you have access not just for the Father and the Spirit and the Son come into you, but for you to go back through that door, because it's a two-way door. It's a wormhole, effectively, into another realm, another dimension, if you want a scientific term for it. So literally, when I first started engaging in my spirit, I was just captivated by God. I mean, to see the face of God, to look into his eyes and to be embraced by the Father or Jesus was amazing. And I loved that. So I'm not really too much bothered by what it looks like around me, because I'm just looking one place. So someone asked me, what does your spirit look like? And I'm like, oh, I don't really know, because I never really bothered to look. I know there's gates in there because I've engaged the gateways in my spirit, the places where things flow out of, but I never really looked like, well, what is it? Here's the door. Wow, God. So when I started to do activations with other people, I started to, rather than get caught up in the activation, because I could get lost sometimes, I just thought, well, I'm going to observe. So I started to observe. And so when I looked into my spirit, I realized my spirit was in the form of a mountain. Well, that made total sense when I realized that I'm a mountain and I am a place of authority. I realized that there were thrones in there. There was this, all I can describe it as was like a portal, which was this door, which I couldn't see the top of because there is no end to it. So I started to look a little bit closer at it. And I'd never thought about going back through the door because I was always just, oh, it's great to be embraced by God. And I'm in the presence of God. So I never really thought about it. And then we did an activation with a group here, and we were just feeding back what happened. And this lady, she said, oh, I went back through the door. And I thought, oh, yeah, why didn't I think of that? Because I could access heaven by going in through the open door, but I'd never accessed it through my own spirit, which is a direct access into the garden. Whereas the other access, you have to go through the realm of the kingdom of God, kingdom of heaven, to go into the tabernacle through the gateway of the way, the truth, and the life. So there's a process in government. Here is relationship, no barrier. And I'd never, ever really thought about that. So I started to go through that gate, and I found myself immediately in the river of life or by the river of life. Sometimes I would jump in the river of life and just go back up through that portal, whatever. So it's open if you open it, but you have to open it. That's the key. So again, what I want to encourage you to do is to close your eyes and just begin to think of that door. Any door that opens up in your spirit, just begin to think of a door and think of the handle of that door being on your side of the door. So as you think of the door, and you can picture a door that maybe you're familiar with, as you picture it, just let that form a doorway for you to step through. So by faith, reach out, open the door, and then wait for the presence of God to come and embrace you. Let the Father embrace you. Just feel his presence, feel his love. And then just by choice, ask the Father to take you back through the door into Eden. So as you step through the door, you step through a veil and you're transported into the realm of Eden. There is the river of life. So just ask the Father to show you whatever you need to experience. For me, I'm just going to get in the river of life. I'm going to enjoy myself and just float around and just experience that life surrounding me and flowing through me and flowing in me. And beyond the river, there's the waterfalls that are cascading down that we engaged with earlier. You can engage that. You know, you can float up a waterfall. There's no physics in the realms of heaven, which is gravity based. So you can float up, you can float down. If you float up that, maybe the Father will take you the scenic route and walking along the pathway, enjoying the awesomeness of the colors and the fragrances and the frequencies of that. If you follow that path, you can end up going to, there's like a bridge and you can cross over, you can go into the Father's garden. Or you can carry on and you can go up the waterfalls and end up by the river of life and the tree of life. But if he takes you into his garden, which is the most beautiful expression of paradise, just rest. It's the place of most perfect rest. Again, there's waterfalls in the garden. There's a beautiful pool. will take you deeper into some things. And if you keep following the river, you'll end up engaging the tree of life with beautiful fruits and scrolls that are there that you can take. In the realms of heaven, when you receive things, mostly you can eat them and take them into yourself. And then you begin to absorb whether it's fruit, whether it's a gemstone, whether it's a scroll. Just take it into yourself and it will unveil revelation. Maybe the Father will take you to the throne of grace. And on the throne of grace, he will put you on his lap and you can place your head on his breast and you can feel the rhythm of his heart. And you can just offload everything. Any needs, you can just offload them onto him and just come to that place of perfect rest. When I first started engaging this, I would spend hours there, not just a couple of minutes. And this is just a taster and an encouragement for you to pursue the same thing. That every time that you open that door that's described in Revelation 3:20, you can engage the presence of God within and you can step back through that door. Yeah. Then from that door, you can go wherever. And sometimes the desire of your heart will take you there. You know, if you really set the desire of your heart on something, then God opens up that for you to engage. So, you know, I desired to engage the waterfalls because waterfalls are something I've always liked, you know, and I've seen quite a few of them. I've been close to them and I really felt the energy just from a natural waterfall. So I always wanted to go to waterfalls. And then after a while, I discovered that there were things behind the waterfall that I never knew. And I found there was a cave behind the waterfall there. And I went into the cave and I met Enoch. You know, and from Enoch, he gave me some things to do. You know, so I avoided going back there for a while. So I kept getting things to do. Quests, he called them. Now I'm sort of a, you know, Lord of the Rings type guy. So quests and adventures are all part of my makeup. You know, as a kid, I loved adventures. I'd make up my own adventures, you know, and go out and explore and do things. So God made me that way. So he uses the way he made me to engage in things. You know, some people, they find rooms and things like that attractive and things that they find, they go into rooms or the library room and the record room. And I've been in those places, but they don't hold the same sort of thing than the garden or a waterfall or a beautiful river or those type of things. So that's the way generally I engage. And I spent time in each place and I would spend some hours. Now, time in the realms of heaven functions differently than time is here. And there are different realms of heaven. The closer you get effectively to God himself, and the realms of heaven are the kingdom of God, kingdom of heaven, heaven, heaven of heavens, perfection, eternity. Now that's not eternity outside of, but it's the closest you can get in the created realms. And the speed of light is different in there because we operate in created light, the sun, but heaven is made of creative light, and we are spirits are creative light. And the closer we get to God, the closer we get to the optimum speed of light. So everything then becomes now. Einstein said, if you approach the speed of light, then you live in the constant of now. And he's true. So the kingdom of heaven, kingdom of God, which is where our mountains are and where the court of the accusation is, and that court system, all that stuff's there. And that seems to operate a little bit faster than this speed. So it's always before this realm. So the things that are coming out of that realm you would call prophetic, because they've not yet happened here, but are established there and are decreed there, so they can happen here. So they're always slightly before. But then the next realm seems to be quite a bit before. So you can be there like an hour and it can feel like you've been there a day. You know, so things can happen. You think, oh, consciously you may not be able to receive everything, but actually you're receiving a lot more than an hour's worth. So when you get into heaven, it's more. When I first engaged in heaven in 2008, I had experiences which were so profound that they couldn't have happened in the hour that I was there physically in. Because it felt like I was in one place, felt like so long, but I was receiving in that because time's different there. So don't think, well, 5 minutes isn't much. Actually, sometimes 5 minutes can give you a lifetime's worth of change just by being able to receive what you engage. But I do like to spend as much time as possible. So, you know, when I first was engaging this, I would spend hours, you know, just being in the Father's garden, just floating and being at rest. And what he was trying to teach me was stop trying to do stuff and just be here with me. Because the first time I went in there, it was just like, wow. Then I started to rock. I'm like, I'm rocking. He didn't say anything. And I wasn't even looking at him, but I sensed it was like, be still, you know, stop trying to do stuff, you know. And eventually I learned to be part of the atmosphere of that place because it felt like I was one with it. And that's what God wanted me to become, totally at rest and peace. So I was just becoming one with his love. And as I was there one day, I was floating and I felt like I was totally weightless. I had no sense of feeling, and it was like all the atoms of my whole being just exploded, and they all went out. It was like everything that held me together, the bonds all disintegrated because I was so restful that I just went out and I connected with the whole of creation. And I felt the groan and the disharmony, but I also felt the heart of God for it. And I felt, wow, this is what it should be like. And I felt responsible in the sense I felt I have a part to play in this. You know, I've been created as part of creation, but to be responsible for some things. And I actually began to connect to the areas of creation that I had a mandate to engage with. Just because I connected to it in a way which I could never have done just by sitting there, I had to be connected. So a lot of these things happen, and there are many experiences there sitting on the throne of grace. You know, sometimes, you know, I used to make up excuses to go to the throne of grace just because I love sitting on the Father's lap. You know, so I used to think, oh, what needs have I got that I can just go and offload? And I used to think, well, yeah, this is one. I'll make it up, really, because I just wanted to be there. No, actually, he doesn't care. He loves it when I'm there on his lap, enjoying his presence. You know, so sometimes I go because I've got things I would like help with. And all I do is just offload them, and I just enjoy being in his presence. And he does things. While I'm at rest, he's at work. You know, that's what happens when we rest and we stop trying to do it ourselves. It allows him to do the things that we could never do ourselves, or to give us the wisdom, insight, grace to be able to do those things in sonship ourselves, in that relationship and from that relationship. So that's just picking up a little activation there. So sonship is not just about having a restored soul and becoming whole, as wonderful as that is. It is amazing to come into wholeness. And the more integrated and whole I become, the more I feel loved and the more I sense that love, because nothing's hindering it or blocking it. You know, I've gone through some pretty deep experiences to bring me to that point. It didn't happen in an instant. And some of those experiences were really deep. And when we do the next intensive, which is called Into the Dark Cloud, we will go into the depths of some of those experiences that deal with the soul and bring wholeness and separation from soul and spirit and reintegration, so that we can be free to live in dual realms and are not tethered to the earth. And I went through a whole relational experience of being prepared for marriage. Because we talked about being the bride of Christ. Well, actually, God wants us to be the husband and the wife, not the bride waiting sometime in the future to consummate our relationship. He wants us to be able to consummate it now. So I went through a whole process of preparing me for marriage. And eventually I got to the point where it was like, oh yeah, let's agree this marriage relationship. I'm going into the bridal chamber and going into an intimacy to become one spirit with God. And it sounds quite intense, and it is, you know, but it's a wonderful experience. And then when I got there, it was like I wasn't ready. I thought everything that I'd gone through to make me ready, and I wasn't ready. And God knew that I wasn't ready. So he took me through a 4-month process where it was an intense process of dealing with my soul, because I thought my soul was dealt with, you know. I look back and think, oh, how stupid was that? But actually, I dealt with behaviors, I dealt with motives, I dealt with attitudes, I dealt with a lot of things. But what I hadn't dealt with was the very core essence of me being in control. So me needing to know what was going on, because that's how God wired me, you see. He wired me. My redemptive gift is prophet teacher. So as a redemptive gift, I look at the world and I see how it works. And I want to see how it works, and then I want to explain it to everybody. That's how I'm wired. So I'm inquisitive. I was inquisitive as a child. You know, I was a hassle to my mum because I was always taking things apart. I wanted to see how they work. What was inside this radio? You know, and then, you know, when I'm 5, I can take things apart, and I couldn't put them all back together. So there was always stuff that never got back together again. So that's how I was. But God then opened up this amazing realm of heaven. So I'm like, I want to know everything, you know, and my soul wanted to know everything, because when my soul knew what God was doing, I was safe, I was secure, and my identity was coming from knowing. And I didn't realize that, but God did. And God wanted to take me into the realms beyond the kingdom of God. And I wasn't going anywhere because he couldn't trust me, because I was going to use all those experiences to validate who I am, needing to know. So he took me through a process of 4 months, and it was the hardest 4 months in my life, but the best 4 months in my life in some ways, but very, very hard for my soul. And after the 4 months, I eventually surrendered. I gave up. You know, having fought, battled, my soul just was out of control, really. Not in any sin way, just desperately needed to know why God was putting me through this. You know, so eventually I gave up, surrendered, and immediately my soul was completely separated from independence and was integrated with my soul and spirit. From that day on, my spirit has been in the realm of heaven continually. Before that, I could only step into heaven and step back out of heaven, because my soul would not let my spirit stay there. I had to be there to know what was going on. Then I could explain it. And then I'd step back out, and then I would try and do whatever I saw in there. So I was never flowing out of heaven. I was always stepping into it, experiencing something, stepping back out and trying to outwork that experience, mostly through my own understanding. So God took me through this process. So I gave that up. I just surrendered. And I'll go into that in a lot of detail when we do the next intensive thing. But what I want to encourage you is, having a restored soul is amazing, but that restored soul brings a balance between spirit, soul, and body. And it brings a freedom for the spirit to be in the realms of heaven, living in dual realms or multiple realms, and be completely connected to my soul. So the reason I can answer a lot of questions and do a lot of things is because my spirit is in heaven, seated in some places, and that is flowing from there to here. Now, the scientific term is quantum entanglement. Two things can be in separate places, divided by millions of miles or a dimension, and still be completely connected. So my soul now comes into agreement with my spirit. I resonate. So I'm resonating with God. I'm vibrating at his frequency, and my soul begins to vibrate at the same frequency as I'm vibrating with God. So I'm instantly in agreement and in cooperation, rather than, well, I need to do this for me. You know, so once that happened, I was free to go beyond and beyond. So sonship is about being in the Father and the Father being in us. It's beyond just a relationship to being a position. We are in him. He's in us. And when we're in him, we can be anywhere he is, because he's omnipresent in any time or space. So I've gone back into time and seen things, because in the early days, I was inquisitive to know how things worked. I haven't been back to do that for quite a while, because now I figure that God will show me if I need to know anything. So I don't do that. But initially, you know, there were some things I really wanted to know. And so I stepped onto the timeline and I went back to see, you know, things like how the pyramids were built. You know, well, why did you want to know that? I don't know. Something, I've been to the pyramids probably 5 or 6 times, been in them. And every time I went in there, I thought, well, there's more to this. I felt an energy. I felt it. I know people talk about pyramid power, but actually there is energy in that pyramid, because it's a mountain. It's the form of a mountain. And it's the form of the New Jerusalem. It's a pyramid, not a square, not a cube. So I'm in it, and I wanted to know how it works. So I went back and I looked, you know, and it wasn't made by thousands of slaves or piling up sand. It was done through sound and light, because they had the ability to use sound to lift things and levitate things, and light to cut things and all sorts of stuff. So my desire led me into places, but now his desire leads me into places. And I don't go and search some things out that I used to, because I used to try and find out. So I know that I'm in the Father, and in him, I have access to anywhere that he wants me to go. So I make myself available all the time, particularly when I go to sleep at night. You know, when I go to sleep at night, I'm going to change the battery.
Sounds like you're talking about time travel.
Well, yeah, I am talking about time travel. And, you know, one of those time travel things is like, oh, that battery didn't work at all, and that's a brand new one.
I'd like to go back to the Kennedy assassination.
Well, let's try and put this one back in. Okay, all right, well, we'll just have to leave it like that. So, yeah. Oh, dear. Let's stick it up there out of the way. I did find that because I made myself available to God, that I was asked to do things because some other people didn't want to do them. So I thought, that's cool. I get to do a lot of stuff. And one of the things I was, one day, I was engaging with the presence of God. I was going to go to sleep, so I went into the garden and I went to rest. And I just said to God, I'm available for an adventure. That's what I said to him. So I was thinking, hey, who knows? I'm going to go to sleep. And what happened was he took me, or I had access to go into the past and be used. And so someone was praying, asking for help, for healing, because their child was dying. And this was in 1760 something, in the middle of America somewhere. And it was just like, okay. And I found myself there, and I went to the door of the house, and I went in, and they were seemingly open to come. And I was, I don't know, my spirit was whatever it looked like to them, but a person. So I went and I prayed for the child, and they got healed and they got restored. And I came out of it and came back, and it was just like, whoa, how does that work? And I suddenly started to have all these things. I love time travel and thoughts of time travel and how does it work, and paradoxes and all that sort of stuff. I thought, well, how could I have gone back in the past? Well, because I'm in him, it isn't the past. It's my present. So I'm only aware of I've done this now, but I've always done it. So I was always used to pray for that person because they were crying out and no one was available. So I was available. So I've done that quite a few times. And I know lots of other people have also done that, because you're not limited by time or space when you're in him. So I think people look at me like, ugh. It's just, that's what you do when you get to be a son. You get to be involved about the Father's business. And when people are praying, God uses us to answer people's prayers. So we can do all sorts of adventurous things because we're in the Father and positioned in him, and we're then able to engage. I've been standing here on a Sunday morning sometimes and worshiping, and because we have an open heaven, I just love to go and engage and be available. So I've been multiple places around the world just from standing here in the room. Now I'm no longer in the room. Soul and spirit, it's gone, but my body's still here. And I've seen a few other people that have been that, and they look rather glazed because they're just not there, because they're somewhere else. And that's actually what God is looking for, to use us. Wouldn't it be wonderful if our worship services were around the throne of God in heaven, and we're all there on the Father's business and being assigned all over time, space, and history? Well, it can happen if you're open to engage these things and not be limited by the restrictions of being earthbound. And that's when my soul was set free from its earthboundness. It opened up all these realms for me. So sonship is about being positioned in the Father so he can position us as his express image into creation. Because we're his sons, we're his representatives. So he wants to position us in positions where creation responds to us, and we bring restoration to it. And that's why he's teaching us the things of sonship. Because it's not, okay, lay hands on this person and they'll get well. That is something we can do here when we're mandated to do it. It goes way, way beyond that into much more significant things. So sonship is about being positioned and seated and enthroned in heaven. So it's there that our governmental position can be manifested through our lives. That's why we need to be seated in heavenly places. We can administrate in heaven and outwork on the earth. So sonship is then about being a gateway for the Father to touch the earth through our lives. In John 14, Jesus said, "The Father in me does his works through me." Not independently of Jesus, but in total cooperation and relationship. They were one. I am the Father are one, he said. So we want to get that point where we're joined to the Lord and like one spirit. So am I doing something, or is the Spirit doing something? You can't tell because you're one. You don't know. You're just you. But you're you in relationship with God in a totally different way to touch the earth, to bring heaven to earth. So sonship is being a gateway for the Father to touch others. So that is changing in how we do it. It used to be, well, the man of the power for the hour would stand up the front and do all the laying hands and laying everyone flat on the floor and doing all that stuff. And we used to do all that. I've done that. I've prophesied over people for 4 or 5 hours at a time until everyone was finished and 2 o'clock in the morning. Because the Spirit would come on you and you could be empowered to do that sort of thing. But actually what we really need to do is to equip everyone to do what God's saying, not one person do it on behalf of everybody. And the old model is that we have a mediator who represents us and does things for us. So God speaks through them, or God gives them revelation and they give that revelation to us or not. That really is an old model. God wants everybody to be equipped to be able to release his love and power into people's lives, because you're actually seeing what's going on, not just magic, hoping for the best by laying hands on someone and in the name of Jesus, hoping it's going to work. We have to direct the flow of the grace of God to empoweredly touch the areas that need healing. Most physical healing is a result of emotional things. So if you don't heal the emotions, then the physical things just keep returning. So you've got to get to the root of the issue. Well, how do you see the root of the issue? You need to read the thoughts and intentions of people's hearts. That's what Jesus did. He reasoned and knew what their reasoning was. Now, I'm not talking about reading people's minds for a party trick, but it's knowing where the fragmentation and the brokenness is in people. So when you do pray or lay hands on them or speak into their situation, you're actually doing it as a precision instrument, not a blunderbuss or a shotgun, hoping to spray all this stuff out there and hoping some of it will stick. Because it's what I used to do. I'd pray everything I knew to pray and hope something worked. Sometimes it would be very sort of directed and it would be right. And sometimes it would just be, well, I'm going to go for everything. I'm sure something will work in the end. I've prayed for casting out demons for people for hours and hours and hours, and one insight would have got rid of it in a second. But I didn't know how to see that way. Now, you can get words of knowledge from the Spirit, but the Holy Spirit wants to teach our spirit how to function that way. Not be dependent on the Spirit telling us things, but be able to see and hear for ourselves. So to touch others, we need to be able to engage at a different level. And that means you can see into people's DNA, you can see into the fabric of their being, you can see where trauma is trapped in cells, you can see where people are stuck and fragmented. Now, I can see some of it, but I don't actually minister it. Because if I did, I would end up being the focus of everyone wants me to pray for them. And I'm not going to go down that route again. So I administrate and legislate in the heavens for other people to be able to do that, not me. Because I know what the trap is, that everyone wants you to pray for them. And actually, God is the same God who works through all of us. But if we can all be equipped to be like Jesus and do the things that Jesus did and do them in the way that he did them, then we will be able to go beyond doing the works to the greater works. And the greater works will go way beyond most of your capacity to take hold of them at this point in time, because they involve the ages to come, not just this age. And there's a lot out there of fun for us to engage that with. Anyway, I'm not getting very far. So, but this is supposed to be like 10 seconds, so I'm sort of sharing whatever needs to be shared. Anyways, so sonship is about being part of a family in relationship with Father and each other. It's about being about our Father's business. So what is the Father's business? Well, we need a relationship with him to unveil that. So I want a mandate. Now, I used to go and get a mandate every day. I'd go into the realm. This is when I was still stuck, having to go in soul and spirit. I'd go into around the ark of the presence of God. I would engage with the ark. I'd want to know the will of God for me today. And I would get that will. I'd have a mandate and I'd go to my mountain and I would decree it. And then I'd come back and try and outwork it. And it was okay, but that was just one level of maturity. I was operating in lordship, and God would show me what he wanted to do, and then I would go and do it. But then he wanted to take me beyond that into kingship. And so when I then got my soul and spirit separated and reintegrated, then I was just being there. And I didn't need to know as a list of here's what you're supposed to do every day. He wrote it into my heart. It shaped and drew my desires, and I just followed and outworked it. So I didn't need to have a list. And I thought, okay, how did Jesus do it? So I asked him. The first few times I went into heaven, he kept saying, what do you want to know? So I think, and I just asked him the most bizarre things sometimes because it was a thing that popped into my head. And one of the things I wanted to know was, well, how did you do that stuff? And he showed me how he did some specific things about how he multiplied things and how he became invisible and how he passed through things and how he walked on water and how he did a lot of miraculous things. And they weren't magic. He just used the laws that he created the universe by with a higher law to suspend it. So he was able to do lots of things. But I wanted to know, well, how did you know what to do? It's like, it says you see what the Father is doing and you only do what you see the Father's doing. So how do you know? And I had this image that he would go each morning, he would go to the Father and he'd get a list. You get a scroll. And here's all the things you're supposed to do today. 15 blind people, but I thought it would be very specific. Heal this blind person by making some mud, or heal this blind person by speaking to them or touching their eyes. And it wasn't. He just had the heart of the Father to heal people that day. And then he creatively, as a son, chose which way he did it, which is why we can choose the reality when we're in the heart of God. And we can choose to do it multiple ways. We like to have a formula because then it's easy to follow the formula. Then you don't need relationship. We need relationship to flow with these things. So when I go and get a mandate for the day, I'm not getting a list of what I should be doing or shouldn't be doing now. I am knowing the heart of God. And because I'm sat with him in heaven, I'm continually connected to his heart, which is continually being corrected and updated for everyone else's stuff that's going on. So I can always be where I need to be and doing what I need to do, flowing. Because stepping in and stepping out was great, but then I couldn't flow. I just had to try and do what I try and prepare there. And it was as effective as it could be with the limitations of not being there and heaven flowing through me through a gateway. So everything changed when I found I could stay there. And so being about the Father's business is not having a business plan and trying to work it out. It's having a relationship that inspires us and we flow together. I do not work for God. I work with him. I work in cooperation with him and he with me. That's how it works. It's relationship. So we tend to get these sort of maybe these ways of thinking of how we do things that often are not relational, but functional or structural or particularly formulaic. So I can't assume because I did something this way yesterday that I'm going to do it the same way today. Because if I did, I'm presuming that I understand what I need to do without actually being flowing out of his heart and flowing in relationship. So sonship is about being involved in the restoration of all things back to God's original desire and design. Now that includes us. He wants us to be totally restored, made whole, our image conformed to his original pattern. But it goes beyond that into everything else. And that's really when you start to know the heart of God, you start to feel how he is passionate about everything and the restoration of everything. And it isn't just like, well, we're going to have the end agree with the beginning. What about all the bit in the middle? So I used to think, oh, well, everything's going to be restored. Jesus will come and yippee, it'll all happen. And as I engage with God, I realized, no, that's not how it's going to happen. Jesus isn't going to do it. In fact, it actually says that Jesus is going to stay in heaven until everything's been restored. So who's going to do the restoring? God and us together in relationship of father and son around the family business, which is restoration and wholeness until everything's restored. And then it can continue outside of the hiatus that we've been through for the last few thousand years or beyond into what it will be. Therefore, we need to go beyond Adam's sinlessness into what he would have been had he been perfected, because he was sinless but not perfected. That's why he chose to do his own thing. So we all need to be perfected. So tonight, when we get on the firestones, I'll go into that in detail about what it is to be ascended. And to ascend and to be matured, because we have to be matured sons. We're all sons, but we may be crawling, or we may be toddling, or we may be wandering around, but actually we need to be mature. And God wants to mature us so that we're part of the decision-making processes of heaven. Because he doesn't want to do things independently of us. He's chosen to include us in his government. And without us in his government's not complete. People, well, God is sovereign. But in his sovereignty, he has chosen to limit his sovereignty to work with us. And so he wants us involved. So when you read about the courts of heaven, it's not all doing court cases about accusations. Most of it, it's about the assemblies and councils of God making decisions which will affect the galaxy or the universe. And we can be involved in some of those things because there is ages to come in which we're going to move from being co-heirs to co-creators. And that's where the fun will really start. Anyway, I'm jumping ahead. So we're all called to be part of what I believe is the Joshua generation. Now, what's the Joshua generation? Now, this is, for me, key, because looking around the room, everyone here is part of the Joshua generation. It looks like you've all been through the wilderness. Some of you may still be there, perhaps, and need to cross over. But the reality is, God is wanting us as his children to be part of a generation that's going to receive our inheritance. Because that's what Joshua and Caleb did. They received the inheritance that they knew belonged to them, and they helped a whole generation to come into it as well. So the Joshua generation are not just those that do it, are those that help other people to do it. So we're forerunners of a heavenly intimacy who've spied out the land. That land is relationship. It's a relational promise to live beyond the veil and to live in dual realms and to function from there into here. Joshua and Caleb were spies. They went into the land and they saw it was good. And they gave a good report. The other 10, so just because you're in the minority doesn't mean you're wrong. And we're likely to be in the minority as a Joshua generation. Because Joshua and Caleb were in the minority. Even amongst the spies, there were only 2 out of 12. And then they were 2 out of 2.5 million. Because all the rest of them, over the age of 19, were all responsible and all died in the wilderness. Because they didn't accept their sonship. What did they say? Well, we're grasshoppers in the eyes of giants. Whereas Joshua and Caleb, what did they say? By all means, let's go up and take possession. This belongs to us. Why? Because they were giant slayers. They saw things from a totally different perspective. It was like, bring it on. And Caleb was like 84 years old, going in and out to war and said, give me the high country. That was Hebron. That was the best of the best of the best in Israel. And guess what? It was a high area. And guess what were there? Giants. So he went and slayed them and took possession of what belonged to him. Well, God wants us to be passionate about what belongs to us. Not disinherited, but inheriting our full inheritance as sons of God. So the Joshua generation are being wooed by the Father into a restored sonship relationship. So there's love about it. The Joshua generation are called to experience the precepts, character, and nature of God, to go deeper into the revelation of God, which enables us to see not the obstacles, but the solutions. To experience the true reality, the very essence of God, who is love. Without love, we will never, ever fulfill God's purposes for our lives. So to live loved, to love living, to live loving. So how does that compare with the Moses generation? Because we've been in the Moses generation, or maybe still in it. And how does Moses work as opposed to how Joshua worked? Because they function very differently. Because Moses became a mediator for the people because the people refused to have intimacy with God for themselves because they were frightened. Because they still were slaves. They'd come out of Egypt, but Egypt hadn't come out of them. So they still have a slavery mentality. And they brought all their foreign gods and stuff out of Egypt and carried them with them into the wilderness. Not a good idea. And ended up with the golden calf and ended up with Moses representing them rather than them having a relationship with God themselves. So Joshua and Caleb, it says, operated according to a different spirit than Moses operated in. The Moses generation are mediatorial. They represent people before God and they tell people what God said. And we're full of that in the church today. Hierarchical coverings that provide the covering for people that will go and hear God, and we're paid to hear God and tell you what God says for the professionals in that role. So the Moses generation provides the priestly earthly coverings. There is no earthly priesthood. Oh, well, we're all kings and priests. Yes, heavenly kings and priests. We're not supposed to be kings and priests on the earth. We're supposed to be kings and priests in heaven. On earth, we're supposed to be oracles and legislators, or prophets and apostles, because those are the foundations of what we do on earth. In heaven, we're a royal priesthood. Unfortunately, we've gone back to old covenant models of earthly priests, an Aaronic order of priests, which means the priests go in to do the intimate things with God and we don't. That's just a perversion. That's an old covenant, not new covenant perspective. So the Moses generation generally will have hierarchical governmental structures. Someone's on top, whether it be the apostle or the prophet or the pastor or the leadership team or whatever you want to call them. There will be someone who's on top and everyone else has to come into line with what they say, ultimately. The Moses generation resists change. And you get that a lot now. People are resisting change because it means giving up their positions of authority, and some of them their livelihoods and the ministries and businesses they've built in the kingdom. Because God's saying cross over and stop telling people what to do. Or cross over and stop giving them prophetic words, but start teaching them to hear God for themselves. I mean, I don't know how many of you have ever been to a prophetic conference. I went to loads of them. Why did I go? Because I wanted to get a word from God. But I've expected it to come through the prophet. And God was speaking to me through those things lots of times, and I wasn't listening because I wanted the word from the prophet, because they're the ones who can hear God. And I don't know about you, I never got one. And the same old people seem to get them every time. And I'm like, well, I've been to many of these things, and why are you still prophesying over the same people and not me? Right? Because God wanted me to hear for himself, so he didn't get me to buy into it. And in the end, I got frustrated and fed up and stopped going. Because it's just like, well, what's the point of paying to go here when I'm not getting anything? So that was part of my journey, because God wanted to speak to me. I just wasn't able to hear very clearly. So if he keep speaking me through someone else, I wouldn't really engage to hear myself. That's the problem. I'm not saying there aren't ministries that are called prophetic or apostolic. I do believe fivefold ministry still exists. It's an earthly ministry to help equip us here to engage there, not to engage there for us. So I don't believe in earthly rabbis or earthly priests or earthly ministers. We're all ministers, and we're all under one rabbi. He's called Jesus, and he wants to teach us in relationship. And we can all hear his voice. So there's a resistance because people are afraid to let go of the old, because their whole livelihood is caught up with it. And some people I know are being called by God to leave where they are and move into the promised land, and they're not going. And I don't want them to die in the wilderness. We were never supposed to build in the wilderness. They didn't build there, did they? They traveled lightly and were able to break camp and make camp whenever God said move. But people have built ministries in the wilderness. They have mountains of their authority in the wilderness, and God is saying, leave all this and cross over. Well, if they'd never built one there in the first place, it wouldn't be so much to let go of. But unfortunately, people are in that place, a lot of people right now. And those people are then helping or stopping other people who are hearing the call of God, and they're trying to put a resistance on those people engaging in heaven for themselves. And you'll find some of the very ministries that talk about open heaven and engaging heaven are not facilitating people doing it themselves. They're resisting it. So the Moses generation lacked true sonship identity. Moses' generation generally have a fear of man. the Moses generation often have one-man ministry focus, and we want to be moving well away from that. So the Joshua generation are those who embrace their inheritance, their birthright as sons of God, in the freedom of the relationship of an open heaven and an open veil. We can't be sons in the Joshua generation without a relationship with our Father. So that's why fatherhood and sonship is so important. We can't have a relationship with our Father without a relationship with Jesus, because he's the way, the truth, and the life. He's the door. You know, no one can come to the Father but through Jesus. You know, that is absolute, for me, non-negotiable. But people can come to the Father through Jesus in multiple different ways. And God does not just do it in one or two different ways. There are lots of ways that he can bring people to the Father. So a relationship with our Father releases us from slavery into sonship. We're no longer slaves or servants or stewards. Doesn't mean we don't have an attitude to desire to serve the purposes of God, but we don't do it as slaves, we do it as sons. So there's a process to go through: transfiguration, transformation, metamorphosis. That whole process means change. Sonship means change. You know, you can't stay a slave and expect to operate as a son. That means our mind needs to be renewed. That means our soul needs to be restored and made whole. That means that our physical body needs to come back into complete health and wholeness, because we do need a body to operate here on earth. You know, if you haven't got a body on earth, you're going to be stuck in heaven or showing up sometimes in the spiritual realm, but you won't have the authority that a person who has a physical body has on earth, which is why we need to be matured in body, soul, and spirit. So sonship brings the responsibility to rule and to bring dominion. That was God's original call to Adam and Eve, to be fruitful, to multiply, to fill the earth, to subdue, and to rule. And that was never to rule over each other. It was to rule over the environment, to make the environment habitable and blessed, so that everyone could prosper and increase. But of course, it ended up in us trying to rule over each other, which ended up in all the nations of the world and all the conflict and everything else, because we're all there trying to make a name for ourselves rather than to honor God's name, which was why the Tower of Babel happened. Let's make a name for ourselves, unless we should be scattered all over the earth. Well, your fear came upon you, because they were scattered all over the earth, and they still made names for themselves, and they called them nations. And we're still suffering from the fact that there are nations all over the world competing with one another, whereas God told Abraham to bring blessing to every family of the earth. And there's a huge difference between family and nations, you know. And so there's a lot to change when we discover how to rule. It's to bring restoration of family. So the Joshua generation are sons who've been through the wilderness years of preparation. And I think, you know, my years of going through the wilderness, going around the mountain, around the mountain, around the mountain, lots of different times, got me to the point where I've had enough. You know, it's got to be more than this. You know, I can't keep doing it like this. And I think that's where I got to. And in desperation, I think my spirit was calling out on God, I need more. You know, that song by U2 was my theme song. You know, I still haven't found what I'm looking for. No, I hadn't found it. And I was searching for it. I've been searching for it for my whole life. Now I found it. It's being home with the Father in heaven and being a gateway of heaven into the earth. So we all need to spy out the promised land beyond the veil. Now, some of us are having first experiences of that. You know, we're all still forerunners. You know, there may be a few forerunners who are forerunners of forerunners, but we're all forerunners, because there's the vast majority of the Christian community have got no idea what I would be talking about. But they will, because God is calling them. There's also a whole realm of people out there who do not yet know God, and they are going to be the next generation. And that's not young people, just young people. It will be young people, but it will be every age. The problem that happened was when this call to reach a harvest went out in 1975, people began to try and make their own harvest of young people, and they spent all their money trying to do youth work and young people's ministry. And there was some success with it, but what they didn't do was raise up the mentors for when those young people would come. So most of those young people didn't have the Joshua generation to enable them to come into their full inheritance. So they just got what their parents had got. And that's why they still get stuck in the wilderness. So we've got to go beyond that. We need to hear and respond to the call to enter beyond the veil, to take up our royal positions in heaven. That's where the real royal priesthood functions, seated in heavenly places, priests and kings of God. So we've got to be willing to mentor the next generation of the harvest. Now, I believe this next harvest is going to be the harvest of the harvesters. So prophetically, it's 1 billion people. Well, 1 billion people is about sort of a fifth or so of the planet. So there's still lots more to come after that. So we need to be those who are like Joshua and Caleb, who are going to say to the next generation, cross over and receive your inheritance. And we're going to walk with you in that inheritance. I'm not passing the baton to anybody. I'm going to walk together with the baton, with everybody. So together we can function as sons of God, because there is no fathers and sons in the kingdom. We should have the characteristics of fatherhood, but without making ourselves to be fathers to people, because God is their father. We're still sons. We're all sons walking together in a relationship with our father. I'm not going to be anyone's earthly father, because they'll be looking to me rather than looking to God. I can say, I'm a son alongside you. I may know a little bit more, have a bit more experience, but I'm going to pass that on. I'm not going to hold it to myself. See, knowledge can be power. And a lot of people know a lot of things and they're not passing it on to people. Because if they keep it to themselves, they're in a position of power. It's like we need to give it away. Freely we've received, freely give. Doesn't mean it's not without value. It has a real value, but we give it because we've received it. And we therefore need to receive it. So we need to equip people to receive their heavenly supernatural inheritance, so they're seated in heavenly places. It's not that, all these Joshua generation are all going to be seated on the thrones of heaven, and we're going to be over all those who are on the earth. No, we're all going to be in heaven. We're all seated in heavenly places. We need to help equip everyone to be there and engage it. So we've got to be willing to establish storehouses on earth, or embassies of heaven on earth, or ecclesia on earth, that are ready for that harvest. That's what the Joshua generation are about, preparing for a harvest. Now, I hear a lot of mystics talking about heavenly experiences. I don't hear too many of them talking about harvest, because they seem to be focused on all the heavenly stuff without saying, well, there's got to be outworked on earth. There's got to be an earthly outworking. You've got to earth it out. What's the point of talking about doing amazing things in heaven if it makes no difference to here on earth? So that's why here we have a ministry in a particular area to help people here on earth, because that's what the mandate we've been given. Other people have other mandates, but we've got to transform our communities. We've got to see heaven change earth. We've got to see heaven manifested on earth so that earth becomes like heaven. We're not going to get that if we're just playing around in heaven and never doing anything here. So it's always going to be an outworking into the earth to bring transformation. And so creation itself will respond to that. So we've got to get ready for that harvest. I believe God's plan is for 3 generations to work in unity together to establish God's government. God's government always works in 3s, Father, Son, and Spirit. That's why we have benches of 3 who are foundational government on the earth. We need to see 3 generations come together. It's never happened beyond Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Because God said, I'm the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And there was a sense where there was a identity within that, which was governmental. And Moses and Joshua could have been the next step to that. But the Moses generation refused to go in. So Joshua had to go and start again. Well, he did things very differently from Moses. See, Moses parted the Red Sea with his staff. Moses struck the rock and water came out. Moses went into heaven. Moses brought the law and wrote the tablets. Moses did all that for them. When Joshua comes along, it's like, well, how are we going to cross this Jordan, which is in flood? Okay, here's a heavenly revelation. Let's step with the presence of God, his ark, and step into the water, and it will part. Joshua didn't do anything other than help them hear what God's saying. And then the waters parted and they crossed. So if Jericho had faced Moses, what would he have done? Probably brought the walls down with his staff. But what did they do? They all marched around it with the presence of God, the ark, in their midst, 7 times around, and then another 7 times, 13 times all told. So what happened? Then they all in unison shouted, and the walls went into the earth. They didn't collapse and crumble. They actually sank into the earth because the frequency of the vibration of their voices opened the earth and it sunk. And they found some of it. They found some of the walls. And they were pretty big walls. You had chariot races on top of them. So they were quite big. So everything was done differently. Now, the angel of the presence of the Lord came into their midst. Rather than Moses went up to the mountain with a private audience, now the angel turns up in their midst. Everything changed, and they did things very differently. So we have to make sure that we don't revert to old covenant Moses ways. And this is why understanding the new versus the old is important. So we have to transition out of the wilderness into the promised land. And it's quite a difficult transition when you're used to doing things an old way, and God suddenly starts to give you new ways of doing it. And we've taken quite a long time here, and we're still in the journey. So the Joshua generation needs to rise up and be ready for the next generation, ready for those supernatural harvesters. 2 generations reach out to the third. That third generation can usher in the ages to come. If we get 3 generations working together, if we don't, we're back to square one. So I really don't want to miss it. And I intend to be around for it. I don't intend finishing whatever I've got to do until it's finished. So I want to be able to live unrestricted by physical death until I either finish my thing and end up going like Enoch or Elijah into that realm, or I'm here when Jesus returns. But it won't happen unless we get these 3 generations functioning together. So as the Joshua generation, we have a key in doing that. We need to learn the lessons of the previous generation, not make the same mistakes. So 1 Corinthians 10:11 says that these things happened to them as an example. They were written for our instruction, upon whom the ends of the ages have come. We need to learn the lessons and engage that. So God showed them their inheritance in the promised land. They refused to go in, so they stayed living in the wilderness. Now, the wilderness was a miraculous place. It's like their clothes didn't wear out. They got food turned up every day out of heaven. Quails come into their camp because they complained that they didn't have any meat. So God gave them that. And they're groaning and mumbling, complaining all the time. And yet God still blessed them. But then they had to go out of the accustomed place of immaturity where God did it all for them. Now they had to go in and take possession. And God didn't drive everyone out in front of them. He just prepared them to be able to drive them out. So they were frightened of them. It's like they were frightened of the children of Israel, but the children of Israel saw themselves frightened of them. So they didn't go in, but Joshua and Caleb were different. So Moses did things his way, Joshua did things in a different way. So God's been calling out of heaven, releasing a sound as this vibrational frequency, carrying this message which has been connecting with people's spirits. It's the reason why you're here, because something has drawn you to realize there's more. You're not satisfied with the wilderness anymore. You want something of the promises that belong to you as sons, and that eternity in your heart has been connecting you with that, and you want more. So the spirits of God's children are resonating with that sound. There's something creating this agreement that's drawing us into our inheritance, crying out, there must be more than this. So 40 years ago, this prophet, Bob Jones, released this sound out of heaven. It was the 8th of the 8th, 1975. And it was a prophecy of this billion-fold harvest. It was a call to raise up a Joshua generation of supernatural mentors, and they missed the call. What they did is tried to get the harvest. So they raised up evangelists, and they raised up youth workers, and they tried to get a harvest. The call really was to, hey, heaven's open. I mean, the guy who gave the prophecy was talking about being in heaven and engaging the angels all the time. But what didn't he do? Equip others to do it. He kept it a mystery. Now, that's part of the reason why people didn't embrace what the call really was, because there was mysteries attached to it that were never released. And no one was equipped to go there and engage heaven. So it became an earthly outworking. So I believe we need to not fall into that same mistake. So over that 40 years, which went up to 2015, we saw a huge increase in the Holy Spirit and increase in dreams and visions and ecstatic encounters, because God was going to break through whether those people were going to release that revelation or not. So he almost circumvented that whole grouping and reached people in spite of it. We need to wake up. We need to rise up from your sleep. That's really what God's been saying for the last 40 years. You can hear me. You can come into heaven. Why are you going to prophetic conferences? Why are you asking the apostle for a vision? Come to me. Wake up, Neo, the Matrix has you. We've been living under an illusion. It's a delusion. It's been a veil of religion that's been over our eyes. And we've not been able to see the truth of who we are. Well, that's changing. We need to arise and shine as stars, restored to our positions of heavenly government. So in 2012, I prophesied a 3-year period of preparation was beginning. And we went through a really difficult 3-year period, including me going through that 4 months of preparation. And then in August the 8th, 2015, 888, triple new beginnings. And that month had 3 days where there was 888. So that August 2015, the end of that old generation, which I believe was the end of figuratively the Moses generation, or issued in a new government of new beginnings, the new governmental order. That's when people start talking about the order of Melchizedek, rather than the earthly priesthood, the heavenly priesthood. So the Joshua generation living according to the order of Melchizedek, engaging with the 4 faces of God, engaging in the name of God. And we'll look at that in some other sessions. So it's a heavenly order. Now, Arthur Burke, who I really like because he's very empirical in his evidence-based stuff, he prophesied the end of the ruler and the beginning of the priest, because it was like, this was not an earthly, this was going to be a heavenly. I'm not sure he knew what he was prophesying, but I certainly responded to it. So I believe it marked a call for deep calls to deep. I was sent a book in 2012 by Mark Verkler, who I really respect as a guy who's helping people to hear the voice of God. And it was a book called When Heaven Touches Earth. And the message behind it was, this is a call for the reformation of church. And the reformation was to restore angelic and heavenly encounters as the norm rather than an exception. And he asked 95 leaders around the world to sign it, endorse it, like Luther pinned it on the church, the 95 Thesis. This was going to be the same, and it was going to be done over the internet. And so I got a copy. I don't know how I got a copy. I was sent a copy from somewhere. So I read it and I thought, oh, yeah, this isn't enough, but this is a start. So this is after I'd been in heaven and had all these experiences. So for me, this was just normal, everyday life. But people from right across different streams endorsed this. And I believe it was a mark of, this is the beginning of the end of the beginning of the end. So it was not it, but it was the start of something that now we are then moving into. So that 3 years ended up there. I signed that. I believe that was a turning point, a point. Sometimes you get kairos moments in time where God does something. And it's a significant thing. And you learn to see those significant signs. And this was one of them. Because I've talked to people, and lots of people had engagements in 2010. Where I did, there were awakenings. People started to get an opening in their hearts. Things happened. 2015 again there was a change. 2012 things started to happen. Ian Clayton talked about the end of the fivefold ministry order, or the apostolic order, and he aligned that with the Mayan calendar ending in 20th of December 2012, which was actually the end of one complete cycle of the circle of the deep, the constellations. which was actually a significant thing. And I think it was the end of the government of that, but not of their function, because they have an earthly function. So it began the reformation of the church into the ecclesia of God. So I hesitate to use church now to describe what God is doing, because I don't believe people will hear that word and understand. But ecclesia carries a different connotation. And ecclesia are people gathered around a blueprint of dominion from a heavenly position into the earth. And so God is releasing blueprints to people all over the earth to establish heaven on earth. Form benches of 3 around that blueprint. So this was great, this 888 triple new beginnings. It was a really, really interesting time. End of the old generation and the beginning of the new governmentally, and then we move on from that. So God has taken the kingdom from those who are operating in the wilderness and is giving it to the people who are operating in heaven, basically. Matthew 21:43, this was talking about the old and the new covenant. Therefore, I will say to you, the kingdom of God will be taken away from you and given to a people producing the fruit of it. Those in the wilderness are not producing the full fruit, and therefore the authority is moving. And in fact, a lot of them are dying. And hence you'll see some of the major people who are leading some of those ministries and groups are actually beginning to die physically because they've not responded to the call to cross over. And some of those people, maybe people will be quite surprised about, because they're well-known people in the old order. But, I've said this a lot. God would rather have an amateur in the new than an expert in the old. And that qualifies all of us to embrace the call of God, to receive a blueprint out of heaven, and to see that outworked on the earth. So I believe that kingdom government has been removed from the old order. Now, as the order of Melchizedek, as the Joshua generation, we can embrace being seated in heavenly places, crossing over into the inheritance in heaven to outwork that on the earth. I think we've run off quite a lot, so I think I'm gonna just leave it there, and we'll have a little break, and then we'll come back and we'll do some questions and answers and things. But I want you to, hear the call that I sent out last night. What God was saying. Get your spirit to listen to the call that's calling you to rise up as that Joshua generation and take your places seated in the heavenly realms, but also to be willing to receive blueprints from heaven to establish things on the earth. Because that's ultimately what God wants. Heaven manifested on earth, not just heavenly tourist trips into heaven. It's great to explore and have fun in heaven, but there's a purpose to it as well. And that's heavenly government manifested here on the earth. Okay, all right.